7. The number of teams that have won the English Premier League since it began in 1992. This is a pretty elite group. For the most part, the reason these 7 clubs have had such success can be explained pretty easily. We have Liverpool, Arsenal and Manchester United, who are all very historically significant and successful clubs. Through that, they've been able to invest, recruit, push on and breed even more success as time has gone by. Then we have Manchester City, Chelsea and Blackburn, who, while still being big, historically significant and successful clubs themselves, have undeniably been given a helping hand by way of large influxes of funds in short periods. I'm not arguing for or against that, I'm just saying that's a fact. Then we have the 7th team. This one's a little more difficult to explain. A seemingly average team that had been bouncing between divisions throughout its existence. A team that finished in 14th place the year before they shocked the world and were labeled as a success story because of that alone. A team whose odds of winning the whole thing were 5,000 to 1. Realistically, these guys never stood a chance, right? Well,
Premier League champions 2016, Leicester City!
This was not supposed to happen, but it did. And 10 points separating them from the pack proves this was no fluke. Leicester's rise to the top was met with skepticism from absolutely every angle on their way up. But in the end, to the dismay of all the doubters, in the words of a wise, scholarly man, you chat shit, you get banged. Today, we talk about how it all went down. So, how did they do it? How did Leicester City win the English Premier League? What's going on everyone, I'm Tinashe, hope you're all doing well. We're going to go deep with this one, and as is the case when I do these team profiles, I feel it's really important to give the full context of the lead up to these incredible achievements so we all understand exactly why they're so significant. And if you're not interested in all that, this video is timestamped, so feel free to skip ahead. There's no judgment here. Maybe a little, right? That's enough faffing about. Let's start back in the late 1800s. Established in 1884, the club we know as Leicester City was founded as Leicester Fosse, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, but we move. The early years for the club were pretty much riddled with a few highs, but a hell of a lot of lows. It was the early days for this sport in this format, so I imagine that very many clubs and organizations were just trying to find their feet in this thing called organized league football. Leicester, quite impressively, took the initiative of experiencing a wide range of extremes before things became more established. First, they registered their biggest win to this day in 1894 against Notts Olympic in the FA Cup, 13-0. Nice. Then, they registered their biggest loss ever to local East Midland rivals Nottingham Forest in 1909, 12-0. Not so nice. But this is actually a pretty funny story, courtesy of an archived version of the Leicester City official website. Match officials were suspicious of foul play given the fact that this was such a one-sided match and both teams were fighting relegation at the time. Apparently, the reason for this sizable loss was that all the Leicester players had been out cutting shapes at a former teammate's wedding the day before. It's a decent attempt to save face from the boys, I gotta admit, but Leicester was still relegated that year though. The Great War brought a halt to all football activities in the years that followed. Most clubs were struck pretty hard from this, and Fosse were no exception. A combination of financial problems and indirect influences from the war meant that Leicester Fosse was forced to cease operation. But in 1919, from the ashes rose a team that would stand the test of time, Leicester City Football Club. And, as fate would have it, the next 10 years represented the best period the club had ever experienced. A sustained run in the top flight, coupled with the emergence of the club's greatest goalscorer of all time, Arthur Chandler. 273 goals before his time with the club was up in 1935. Leicester won no silverware during this time, but a second place finish with only one measly point separating them from the top in 1929 was a pretty strong effort, if we're all being honest. However, little did they know they would have to wait 87 years before they even got anywhere near that finishing position. But before we go that far in the future, let's make a stop in the 60s. Following the Second World War and going into the early 60s, the club had been through quite a bit. A lost FA Cup final, 3 relegations and 3 promotions. Pretty casual. Having said that, things were looking up. The 60s was a special time for the Foxes. There were very many reasons for this. You may not believe me, but One of those reasons was the weather. Let me explain. The winter of 1962-63 in the UK was absolutely brutal. Known these days as the Big Freeze, this winter was one of the worst in the region in recorded history. Temperatures were as low as negative 22 degrees Celsius. The River Thames completely froze over, and man, was definitely not hot. Despite the cold, Leicester was able to quite literally weather the storm and become one of the only teams to hit form in the midst of the horrible climate. In fact, they were so good that the media gave them a very cool name, the Ice Kings. A 12-game unbeaten streak between December 62 and April 63 put them in pole position at the run-in, but one win in the last 9 games of the season directly after their hot streak left them in 4th place when all was said and done. Despite being labeled the Ice Kings, there was no crown. Even further, they made it to 3 FA Cup finals in the 60s and lost each and every one of them. But there was some good to come out of this period. The first piece of major silverware in the club's history. The 1964 League Cup, a 4-3 win over 2 legs against Stoke City. The next 40 years or so was a mixed bag, to say the least. There were highs, such as the housing of players that would go on to become legends such as Gordon Banks, Peter Shilton and Gary Lineker. They won 2 more League Cups under Martin O'Neill in 1997 and 2000, and they moved into their current stadium after 111 years at their previous one. Walker's Stadium. Gary looks like he's having a lot of fun. But there was the small matter of being relegated and promoted about 8 times apiece, going into financial administration in 2002 thanks to a huge wage bill, a loss in TV revenue, and the costs of a new stadium were less than ideal. Thankfully, they were eventually saved by a consortium led by none other than Gary Lineker. All the same, just 6 years later in 2008, the club found themselves in the 3rd tier of English football. Guys, this was 2008. This team was in the 3rd tier as recently as 2008. I mean, they gained a media promotion back, but that fact just boggles my mind. By 2010, the ownership of the club had changed hands once more. This time, it fell into Thai ownership. Vishai Srivadhanaprabha and his son, Ayawat, owners of the King Power Group. The stadium name was also changed to the King Power. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of information thus far, but I think we all have a decent idea of where this club came from and what the general expectations were. So in the context of this particular video, in a way, the story has just begun. 2011. The beginning of one of the most fabled and unprecedented upward trajectories in sports history. The 2011-12 season of the Football League wasn't much to write home about. An eventual 10th place finish that screamed inconsistency all the way through. A bad start to the season saw the manager at the time, Sven-Goran Eriksson, receive the sack, and in his place came Nigel Pearson. A man who was actually previously the Leicester coach as recently as 2010, but him and the previous owners never really saw eye to eye, which ultimately led to his departure. But with Srivadhanaprabha now in the mix, the story went on. 2013. This is where things get spicy. In the 2012-13 season, things picked up a little. An improved performance in the championship saw them finish 6th. I say improved, but it was only just. They narrowly scraped a place in the semi-finals of the Premier League playoffs only by goal difference. Then they got 3rd placed Watford in the semis and dispatched them 1-0 at home in the first leg. The second leg was a different kind of beast. Picture this. Watford are 2-1 up by the 96th minute and the tie is a draw on aggregate. Anthony Knockaert draws a fraudulent penalty and basically has to score to send Leicester to the finals of the playoffs. That's right, a dive was about to send Leicester through. Karma had other ideas, Knockaert misses, and 20 seconds later, Watford score.
I do not believe what I've just seen! Jordan has scored a penalty! He scored! Oh!
Pandemonium. Like, seriously, this was probably the most viral non-top division moment in recent football history around the globe. It was just wild. I didn't want to mention this, but now that we're talking about it, I kind of have to. When I first watched this match, I thought it was a miracle, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was no fluke. I know exactly why Leicester lost. Even back then, my man just couldn't catch a break, huh? This loss was devastating, but the Foxes very much pushed on from here. Nothing was left to chance the next season as they blew the competition out the water with a 102-point campaign. After a long, painful 10-year journey, Leicester City was finally back in the Premier League. which is, a cool story. But if we're being honest, early into their Premier League return, it really didn't look like they would be back for long. I mean, don't get me wrong, they had some great moments in the beginning. There were moments like the 5-3 comeback against Man United on matchday 5, otherwise known as the moments most United fans lost all hope of success post-Fergie. The ones that hadn't already given up, that is. But moments like that ultimately meant very little by match week 13, as they were rock bottom in the league. By match week 29, they were still dead last, having picked up 19 points. Seeing as odds are the theme of this entire story, if you were a betting man, decent money would say they would end up just about there by the end of the year. That is, of course, if history is any decent indicator of what the future holds. However, despite being a sensible bet, you would have lost money. A mind-boggling 7 wins in their last 9 games ensure their safety and a 14th place finish, 6 points from the drop. The Newcastle side from the 21-22 season may have something to say about this, but this turnaround is, to this day, thought of as the greatest Premier League relegation escape of all time. A miracle for sure, but it was the first of many. Before we get into said miracles, let's drop a couple names so we can get a good understanding of the people that made this entire thing possible. 2015, June. Spirits are high following the craziness of the previous campaign. Nigel Pearson and the board's relationship had been somewhat strained over the course of the year, but after avoiding the drop, his job was seemingly secured. All of that changed when his son was caught in a racist orgy? These are words that shouldn't be placed in the same sentence, but somehow, here we are. In an end-of-season goodwill tour to Thailand, the home country of the club's owners, Nigel's son, James Pearson, and 2 other players filmed themselves in a group activity, which is strange enough, but throw in a spat of racial slurs and other unpleasantries at the Thai girls they were with, and what you have is 3 very questionable characters. Nigel Pearson was, of course, caught in the crossfire of the blowout. It has become clear to the club that fundamental differences in perspective exist between us. Regrettably, the club believes that the working relationship between Nigel and the board is no longer viable. So, out with Pearson, in with Ranieri, Claudio, a man who was already quite familiar with England. 11 years prior, he had been in charge of a Chelsea side pre-Abramovich and was made surplus to requirement when it was believed he was not the man that could take Chelsea to the next level. While his time there was actually pretty successful, establishing Chelsea as a Champions League side before the money, his reputation wasn't always a positive one. He was known as the Tinkerman, as he would constantly change aspects of his squad with little or no visible improvements as the result. If Leicester wanted someone nice, they've got him. If they wanted someone to keep them in the Premier League, then they may have gone for the wrong guy. Sentiments like these from the Guardian's Marcus Christensen were rife, especially considering the fact that Ranieri had managed no less than 7 teams in between Leicester and Chelsea, each yielding very few encouraging talking points, if any. But just remember, it's easy to trash on people's opinions in hindsight. Back then, this was a very reasonable take. Alright, so just to recap, here's what we have going into the 2015-16 season. A team that very many people believe are extremely lucky to even be in the Premier League, and a manager who, while being seasoned, doesn't have the best reputation in world football at that point. I'll say it again, Leicester were not supposed to win the English Premier League. So let's take a look at the players and tactics that prove that statement completely wrong. Like many before and that are still to come, Ranieri has historically been a huge proponent of the 4-4-2 and the 4-4-1-1, 2 of the most balanced formations regarding every aspect of the game. Defense, attack, when used correctly, they can provide all you need. So these guys were anything but conventional champions in how they played ball, and that's mostly because they didn't actually have the ball most of the time. Leicester averaged about 43% possession this season, meaning they were chasing shadows more often than not. But at the same time, they conceded the second least in the league, 36. They made the second most tackles, 869. They blocked the most crosses, 169. They topped the table for interceptions and ball recoveries, 819 and 2,287 respectively. And they only lost 3 times. This is just a snapshot, but the point is that the running and physical exertion of this team was stellar. At the same time, defense and ball recovery can only take you so far. After all, in the wise words of Michael Owen,
when they don't score, they hardly ever win, and that's their problem.
This man is a Ballon d'Or winner, by the way. So let's move on to the usual starting 11 in the most used formation and take it from the top. We start off with a big one, Jamie Vardy, a player whose career is begging to be made into a movie. And I'm obviously not the first to think that. The Premier League Player of the Season and FWA Footballer of the Year in this campaign with 24 goals and 6 assists. At 25 years of age, the guy was playing non-league football. Fast forward 4 years, and he was one of the deadliest strikers in Europe. What a wild time. When Leicester would win the ball infield, this man got right on his bike and countered at crazy pace. And because he was more than just a speed merchant, the result was a goal far more often than not. But of course he had help. With Vardy as the tip of the spear, he had one of Shinji Okazaki or Leonardo Ojoa just behind him. Because the rest of the Prem largely used 3 in the midfield and Leicester played with 2 in the midfield, the supporting striker would often drop in to provide support. With 5 and 6 goals apiece, as supporting strikers, they played their roles extremely well. On the left flank was Mark Albrighton, who was an unsung hero for sure, up and down the wing, assisting and joining in the midfield when needed. Then on the right was another phenom, the PFA Players Player of the Year, Riyad Mahrez. His 3rd season at the club, and he was just playing games with opposing left-backs all year. He was the main assist provider for the team with 11 goals and the 2nd highest scorer with 17. Dribbling in and out, he would almost always know exactly what decision to make in the danger areas. Then we move on to perhaps the most important part of the team, the engine room of N'Golo Kante and Danny Drinkwater. All those defensive stats I mentioned above, these guys were the main contributors. Kante was in his 1st season at Leicester, and based on how he was playing, it's crazy how he wasn't scouted by any of the bigger clubs. The guy was insane. Tackles, interceptions, pressures, you name it. This was actually his average heat map in every match he played. What's that? Huh? You want a source? No, trust me, bro. Trust me. Danny Drinkwater deserves big praise too. He unfortunately hasn't gone on to be as successful as some of the other members of the squad, but this year he put in a real shift. Doing a lot of what Kante did, he was a little bit better on the ball, so a lot of the midfield progression went through him. Onto the defense, and at left back was Christian Fuchs. And no, I'm not going to make a joke about his surname. This is a holy channel. On the right was Danny Simpson. Fuchs was the more attacking of the two and would link up with Albrighton on the left, overlapping a decent bit. When he would do that, depending on the situation, Kante would provide cover in his vacated spot, or Albrighton would add numbers to the midfield. Simpson would hang back to keep the squad's defense sturdy when in position and did a great job at that. He also had company in the form of 2 very large humans, Wes Morgan and Robert Huth. If the ball was high and these 2 were around, you might as well just start prepping for the next phase of the game. They were just the definition of solid. Captain Wes Morgan played every single minute of the Premier League campaign and led his troops as well as any great captain. These 2 were up there in age, and even further, they weren't exactly the most agile of players before that. So the fact that the team mostly sat deep helped them avoid getting caught out of possession more often than they really could have been. Finally, at the back was Kasper Schmeichel, son of Peter. The 2nd most clean sheets with 15 and a stellar season all round meant he certainly lived up to the Schmeichel name and forged his own legacy. All in all, the team wasn't the strongest on paper, let's be real. But it's not like any of that mattered, because in-game, this was one of the most cohesive and well-drilled teams the Premier League has ever seen. A sharp understanding of their own shortcomings and a fearlessness that is rare to find in a club of Leicester's stature prior to the season was just delightful. Onto the season itself, and Leicester's odds of doing anything positive were definitely not in their favour. There was clearly a lot of faith. Regardless, the season started off quite strong. 3 wins and 3 draws in the first 6. Nothing crazy, but uncharacteristically strong for this team for sure. In 6 games, they had more points than they did in 18 in the previous year. That's what you call progress. A 5-2 loss to Arsenal on matchday 7 was expected to bring them back down to earth in the eyes of many, but Leicester and Jamie Vardy in particular had other ideas. After this defeat, they went on a 10-game unbeaten streak that featured 8 wins. It also featured the breaking of a pretty crazy record set by Ruud van Nistelrooy with Manchester United back in 2003, scoring in consecutive Premier League games. The record was 10. Vardy made it 11. And even further, he scored the 11th against Manchester United. That's poetic. The rest of the season only saw them lose 2 more times as they beat every quote-unquote top 6 side at least once, bar Man United and Arsenal, an Arsenal team that actually completed the double on them. Due to how they set themselves up and the limitations of the team, Leicester had to take their chances extremely well and avoid being wasteful at all costs. And because they were really good at doing that this season, it wasn't a rare sight to see them take the lead early on in matches, which is something that caused a lot of teams a lot of problems. Robert Huth explained all of this quite well in an interview with The Analyst earlier this year. You're at your worst when you're chasing the game. You make stupid decisions. Some teams did exactly that. 20 minutes into the game, they were 1-0 down and they were doing stupid stuff. Both fullbacks bombing on, leaving one-on-ones with Vardy on the halfway line. I'm like, what do you think you're doing? You're going to lose. And just about all of them did. One game at a time, they reached landmark after landmark, and people began to realize they weren't leaving the summit. First, they secured top 4.
We are in Champions League, man.
That was my next question.
Dilly dong, come on.
Then, a few weeks later, the big one. The title was confirmed 2 games before the end of the season after Spurs, leaders of the chasing pack, couldn't keep up. And they just imploded really. Second for a large chunk of the season, and the only team that had a chance to catch Leicester towards the end. But when it really mattered, they bottled a 2-0 lead against Chelsea to draw 2-2, withdrawing their hats from the race. And to add insult to injury, Spurs finished the season in 3rd place. They came 3rd in a 2-horse race.
I would class it typical Tottenham performance. They obviously will let you down most times.
This was an incredible achievement for the Foxes and a wild ride from start to finish. Definitely a better kind of roller coaster than what they're used to. Kings of England, with a crown to show for it. This win was miraculous for so many reasons. No team outside of the Big Six had even finished in the top 4 since Everton did in 2005. The last team to win their first top division title in England was Nottingham Forest back in 1977. And, of course, Leicester were expected to be bound for relegation. Okay, so before wrapping this video up, I feel I have to address something. If you had a conversation with naysayers around the time the season ended or had a look at any archived conversations online, you probably notice a trend. A sentiment that goes a little something like, this was an off year. That is the only reason Leicester won. Which, if I'm being honest, is one of the lamest things I've ever heard. It obviously is true that a lot of teams were having an off year or in transition, but all 19 other teams. I mean, you could use this excuse for any other title-winning team then. In any given season, it is a fact that there are bound to be a bunch of teams that are having an off year or in transition. You gotta play what's in front of you, and Leicester did just that. In fact, they were the best at doing just that, and there are 10 reasons proving that this is the case. In the aftermath of the season, it's incredibly difficult to think that they're gonna go down anytime soon. They've pretty much cemented themselves as a top-flight team. However, Ranieri was sacked as the rest of the league got clued up on how to stop them. The traditional big teams inevitably raided them for all their top talent too. Mahrez, Kante, Drinkwater, even Vardy, but the latter ended up staying. An FA Cup triumph in 2020 completed the set of English silverware too. So, I don't think it's a hot take to say that we are still in the golden age of Leicester City. But turning the focus back to 2016, this kind of thing almost never happens in football. Scratch that. This kind of thing almost never happens in sports. Scratch that. This kind of thing rarely happens in life. The quote-unquote little guy almost never prevails. And in the context of the Premier League, this has largely been true ever since this happened. But Leicester? Leicester did something special that year. Something unforgettable. I guess it proves that if you dream big, you just might beat the odds. I mean, you can't win if you don't buy a ticket, right? And there we have it, a comprehensive yet still light breakdown of the incredible highs and the incredible lows of Leicester City Football Club. An inspiration to us all. What do you think of this incredible Leicester team and what was your favorite moment from this season? Feel free to let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. Also, feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, only if you want to. That is all for me today. Had a blast putting this one together. Really hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you're all staying well and staying safe. Cheers, and I'll catch you in the next one.